In 1980, Albert Brown ambushed and strangled Susan Jordan as she walked to school. Brown was sentenced to death in California for murder. He raped and attempted to murder 2 young girls in separate violent attacks and served less time in prison for sexual assault and attempted murder than it takes to earn an associate's degree. A wonderful, perfectly normal country. Not a misogynistic hellhole at all. The 1970s and 1980s were largely free of non-fatal sexual assault and kidnapping cases. Famous examples include Lawrence Singleton, who served 7 years in prison for amputating the arms of a teenage girl he had kidnapped and thrown off a cliff, and kidnapper Steven Steiner, who was sentenced to only 4 years for kidnapping. And to put things in perspective, Steiner was held captive for 7 years. Another case that comes to mind is that of John Davenport. He was sentenced to death by the state of California for stabbing a living woman in the early 1980s. Just a few years before the horrific crime, Davenport had served 4 years in prison for stabbing a woman more than 23 times in her apartment. Public scrutiny of the previously lenient sentences in many of these cases has prompted calls for harsher sentences for their crimes. The culmination was the 1990s murder of Polly Klaus by Richard Davis, a serial predator who had a long list of rape charges, convictions, and even more armed robbery arrests. After news of Davis's criminal record sparked nationwide outrage, lawmakers across the country implemented 3-strikes laws to curb high-risk offenders like him. Brown was a highly exploitative sex offender with a long history of violently assaulting young girls. In one case, he strangled an 11-year-old girl and impregnated her, and served 2 years of probation after pleading guilty. A year later, he broke into the home of a 14-year-old girl and strangled her until she lost consciousness. Because she was helpless, Brown sexually assaulted the girl in her parents' bedroom. In the second incident, Brown was imprisoned for 2 years. In 1980, just 4 months after his release, he ambushed a 15-year-old girl named Susan Jordan as she was walking to high school. Jordan had just finished accompanying her younger siblings to their elementary school before her abduction. Brown dragged Jordan into a nearby bush where he sodomized her and then strangled her to death with her shoelaces. He then dumped the body on a street corner and fled with her school books and identification cards. When Jordan's parents found that her siblings had returned home without her, they notified the police and organized a search. Later that night, Brown called her mother several times. In the calls, he taunted her that Susie hasn't come home from school yet, and that you'll never see your daughter again, and ended up revealing the location of the body. Several eyewitnesses described seeing Jordan with Brown at the time of her disappearance. Co-workers found a tracksuit covered in blood and semen in his locker, and his shoes matched footprints found near the crime scene. Testimony from Brown's previous victims sealed his fate, and the state of California sentenced him to death in 1982. He was scheduled to be executed in 2010. The prison warden even pressured him to read his death sentence during the execution preparations. Hours before the execution, a judge canceled it over concerns about lethal injection procedures. Despite a 2019 moratorium on the death penalty in California issued by Gavin Newsom, Brown currently remains on death row in the state.